Good morning. This is Colleen Cox, End Abuse Education Coordinator. Thanks for joining us today for the development and maintenance of policies prohibiting harassment of LGBTQ people. And we'll be joined by Sharon Lewandowski and also our presenter, Molly Herman.
Just as a brief reminder, the first webinar covered a lot of information about LGBTQ 101 topics, and so you'll see here on this slide again the objectives from that first webinar. The second webinar, which was just offered last week, covered a lot of information about creating inclusive services in effort to, of course, provide good services to LGBTQ people, but also to prevent bullying and harassment, which is, of course, part of that federal language that we're operating under for all the webinars. This third webinar will build on that knowledge and assumes that you have viewed the first two webinars. If you viewed both webinars and still have questions about these topics, we'll have some time at the end for questions. Some people have been contacting me directly, and then we'll also be talking about options for follow-up in terms of technical assistance related to development of policies. And I think Sharon will talk about that at the end. There were some questions that came up in the surveys or evaluations that you all did after the second webinar, and one of them I wanted to quickly incorporate into this webinar because I wish I had done so in the second. And that question was about LGBT safe space, and specifically about safe space stickers. So the diagram that you see here is one example, and it was developed by Kathy Flores, who is also a member of the statewide LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Committee hosted by the two coalitions. And she also is the lead on the Fox Valley Oshkosh LGBTQ Anti-Violence Project out of Appleton in the Fox Valley area. And so this is one example of what a safe space sticker could look like. There are other models. They all look fairly similar, often have a rainbow as part of it. They might actually say LGBT safe space on them. And the reason that I wanted to talk about them is that a lot of times, and I think there are even some trainings available that I'm less familiar with, but sort of about how to utilize safe space stickers, when to use them, et cetera. And so I wanted to make sure that we address that a little bit. So what I always tell people especially in our day-long trainings, is that the expectation of a person when they see this sticker is that everything behind it, all the people behind it, the resources behind it, will be inclusive and welcoming to LGBTQ people. And so a lot of times people get really energized by trainings like this and say, I'm going to put up a safe space sticker in my office, which I think can be a great show of allyship and of support for people. Sometimes these have been used in schools. For example, a school counselor might use them to show that students can talk to them and can come out to them and talk about issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think it's really important to remember that piece that I just said, which is that the expectation will be that, so for example, if this were on a door at the front of your agency, the expectation would be then that people would be treated respectfully related to sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression, and that there might even be the assumption then that people would have been well-trained and have a lot of experience with these populations. And so my caution is always that if you're going to use the safe space sticker, be thinking about who that is applying to at your agency, and that it might be more cautious and yet better move to put this on individual doors where maybe people have had training and experience with these populations. And so one way to think of it is, if this were on your website, what would the expectation be? So then the same would apply to a front door. So I just wanted to make sure that I covered that concept because we did get a question about safe space stickers. So again, great way to show inclusion. Just make sure that you can kind of back that up with the people that are behind the sticker, whether that's on a website or on a front door. All right, so with that, I want to jump into the objectives for this webinar. They've gotten more and more focused on what you will actually do, because we started out the first one with the LGBTQ 101, the second one with kind of the space and services, and now just looking at policies. So this one was developed with 3 objectives in mind, each of which was built on the federal requirements driving the webinars themselves. So first, by the conclusion of the webinar, I hope that you all will be able to name the types of policies that your agencies should have or should develop to protect LGBTQ people from harassment. And this list will include some external policies, in other words, those that are about the people who you're serving, and also internal policies, those that are about how employees are protected. Next, I'll cover what is essentially training and tips for staff to understand these policies and notice when they're not being followed. So we know that policies are only as good as the training and the implementation, so helping people to understand them and then some concrete ways to follow them. And then finally, we'll briefly cover the elements of a plan that would monitor, address, and document claims when policies are not followed, as well as a couple of models of how to respond to bias and hurtful comments. I think a lot of times trainings like these can give people the tools to identify what they might be uncomfortable with or what they might want to say something to someone about when a situation happens, but not how to actually do that. So I'm going to offer a couple of models of what to do and what can be a really uncomfortable situation to both educate and also move people forward. I also heard the feedback that people wanted the webinars to be perhaps a little more interactive if possible and a little more interesting to look at. So we've put polls in again, and the first one is whether you've ever received a complaint from a client about another client based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And I just need to advance. There we go. And so people have an opportunity here to say, yes, that's happened, no, it hasn't, or I'm not sure if that happened or not. I'll skip to the results so you can get the responses as I'm seeing them. Great, so it looks like about maybe almost two-thirds of the group has not had a complaint from a client about another client related to these issues, and about a third of people say that they have received a complaint. So hopefully some of the information provided in the last two webinars and in the one today will provide you with the tools both to have some language to talk about that, but also by the end of this whole process, so not only the webinars but the development of policies, you'll be able to have a policy to refer to, and then all of your coworkers will be on board with that as well, so you'll have some support for how to respond to people. All right, so let's talk about what those policies might look like. So let's start with an ideal situation, and this would be one in which the policies are not needed. So obviously, policies are often there as backup or when something happens. It's nice to use them proactively, and also we hope that we don't, in an ideal situation, you wouldn't have any claims against them and wouldn't have to address them. So you may notice that the first two webinars were very content-heavy. The intent was to prevent harassment, bullying, and discrimination using the tools of awareness and knowledge instead of response. In other words, primary prevention, essentially before anything happens, is always the best approach. In an ideal situation, all of your agency's steps to prevent harassment, bullying, and discrimination will go beyond prevention and lead to the support of an inclusive and welcoming environment for LGBTQ victim survivors and for your own LGBTQ employees and staff. So a few elements of successful prevention in this case include visibility, consistency, and follow-through. It's likely that visibility is the most important since it's what people see and hear about your agency, whether that's a victim requesting services or a potential employee. Without visible inclusion, it may be challenging to bring in LGBTQ clients or employees, and that reflects a little bit on the Safe Space sticker conversation that we just had. Consistency reminds us that communities need to see ongoing inclusion and willingness to improve. If an agency consistently serves LGBTQ people well, word will get around in the community that they can count on you, on people at that agency. We talked a bit about follow-through in the second webinar in terms of really providing the services that you say you do to LGBTQ people. Here, follow-through refers to inclusive services really supporting LGBTQ people and not just allowing them in. For example, one can imagine a situation where an agency's policy might explicitly include transgender women in support groups or shelter, yet when she attends, she might find that the environment is not supportive. So in other words, not just getting people in, but also having it work well for them when they get there. Often when people hear about policy development, they tend to think about a blank sheet of paper, like, now we need to start something entirely new. The good news is that the types of policies that need to be in place to prevent bullying and harassment of LGBTQ people are not all new. The list of policies includes both improving existing policies and creating new ones. So the list of external and internal policies that we're going to cover are not all-inclusive. They will, however, add structure and an insurance policy to the attention that you and your coworkers have already put into prevention of harassment and bullying and the inclusion of LGBTQ people. And because they include policies for serving as well as employing LGBTQ people, the combined effect of the policies is inclusion throughout the agency. Examples of specific language for policies can be found in the links on the we'll be looking at some slides that have the links. We've changed how we did it a little bit. And we also have a resource sheet that will be made available. It was just easier to make the links work on a resource sheet. So you'll have that as well. And then I'll be highlighting a couple of sample policies and showing the actual language. So let's start looking at some of the specific policies, starting with policies that would apply to those that are accessing services, which in this case I'm calling external policies. The first is hopefully one that already exists but may need some specific inclusive language, a non-discrimination policy. This policy should clearly state that your agency will not discriminate against anyone based on sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, gender expression, or relationship status, obviously among other identities. Again, hopefully you already have such a policy that may just need some updated or additional information. Since a policy is only as good as the training behind it, creating an environment that does not discriminate will mean addressing all of those elements from the second webinar, such as print materials, website content, physical environment, phone scripts, shelter, etc. Speaking of shelter, a policy to ensure an inclusive shelter free of harassment and bullying is likely a hybrid of an existing policy that already prohibits bullying, harassment, etc., and possibly some new language about how shelter will be provided to all identities within LGBTQ communities, including males and transgender people. Recall from the second webinar, the federal language prohibiting exclusion of one person from services based on another person's complaint when the criticism was about gender identity. The point is also a good reminder about self-identity versus perceived. In other words, accepting and allowing people into services based on their own identification of gender identity, not how they might be perceived by someone else. After shelter, support groups in any other setting where more than one person is receiving the same service at the same time often brings up questions of who can attend. Staff may be concerned about what other group members might say or do when they don't believe a client fits the definition of someone eligible to access a given service. The prevention work to be done in this case is policy clearly stating which identity groups or other parameters such as age are eligible for the service, and with a clear reminder that staff has talked with all participants and that the overarching commonality is that everyone there is a victim survivor. Of course, such policy would state any other criteria people would need to meet to attend. So let's take a look at a sample policy, and actually one that I think would be pretty easy to just take the language from and make any modifications. Certainly, there's been work done around this such that agencies don't need to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and develop new language. In this case, it's again, because we're talking about external policies, it's a policy that was written for program participants, people that are accessing your services, and it's from the network LORED, Transforming Domestic Violence Programs to Include LGBTQ Survivors. And so if you decided to adopt this policy, you use your program name, and it talks about welcoming individuals of various identities and stating, and then this is something in this case that a person would sign. It says, I will be respectful of other program participants and staff, understanding any oppressive or abusive language or actions are not acceptable. And then it starts to list the people that someone could talk to if they have questions or if they feel like this has been directed at them. So this is an example of something that you could have people in shelter, for example, read. You could discuss it with them. They could sign on to. And obviously all of the sort of details about how you will write the policies and then how you will actually carry them out are something that your agencies will need to decide. And I know, like I said, Sharon will talk about that a little bit at the end. But one of the reasons that I like this is that it really spells out specific language, heterosexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, queer, transgender, and then talks about race, class, etc. And just like that, we are at another poll. I don't believe that all this language shows up on the poll, so I'm going to read this one, and then I'll kind of activate the part where you can respond. So the next two are going to be situations. A shelter resident tells you she's uncomfortable with having a lesbian in shelter and doesn't want their kids playing together. She says the other resident looks like a man, and she doesn't want her daughter to be confused. What would you do first? And I think the options show up in full text. Remind her about your non-discrimination policy, ask her to talk to the other resident herself, or talk with your supervisor after listening. There's the part where you can vote. And I think it's no surprise that there's not really anything wrong with any of these answers. It's just interesting to see sort of what people, what they might do. And most of you are saying, reminding her of your policy. And again, sometimes people could read a policy and still have questions about how that would look or how they should do that, so it might be a great opportunity for some education. So most folks are saying, reminding her of your policy. A couple people have recommended talking to the resident herself, which I think, you know, as long as they can do that in a respectful way, that might be really helpful. And then talking with your supervisor, too. Perhaps if you haven't handled a situation like this before or, you know, questions about it, that's a great move as well. So, again, there aren't any wrong answers. It looks like most people are getting a reminder of the policy, and particularly if the direction that your agency tries to go with is having people sign something, then that can be a really useful talking point, not just, you know, kind of here, sign this, but also let's talk about it, see if you have any questions, any concerns about it. Great. All right, so now we're going to switch our attention to looking at some internal policies, and again, I'm using that to describe the types of policies that you would have within your agency and looking at for fellow employees and for staff. And again, remember, the inclusion that your agency shows towards staff will be communicated throughout the larger LGBTQ community, which also means that victims and survivors will hear about it. So it's a great way to show support to that community by being inclusive and welcoming for employees as well. So again, while the overall goal of these webinars is to improve services and environment for LGBTQ victims and survivors, parallel policies for employees as well as additional staff-specific policies are key to creating an inclusive environment that's truly all-encompassing. So the first policy is essentially the same as a non-discrimination policy for clients, but for the workplace. In fact, if you use language like an environment free of, as opposed to services or workplace free of discrimination, you may be able to use a similar policy. So environment could kind of encompass both. Remember that one of the key elements for success is specific language, so saying gender identity and sexual orientation. Gender expression, which we've talked about a little bit less, but particularly in that poll that you all just completed, it can be really helpful to include gender expression. So the comment that the woman made about the other person looking too much like a man is really talking about gender expression, talking about somebody's clothing, for example, or their haircut or something like that. So it's important to include both identity and expression. Next, you likely already have policies that support families and relationships for your employees. It's crucial to ensure that they protect and support all families and relationships. For example, do your bereavement policies treat equally legal marriages, long-term committed relationships, and domestic partnerships? One way is to use the words partners and in-laws and then define those in a detailed way. For example, and this is sort of a personal example, but it sometimes is a little bit complicated to figure out whether like a bereavement policy applies when a word like spouse is used, if that's not defined, and if a person isn't legally married. It can be sometimes challenging to, like in-laws would be a word that would be hard to know if it applied to you if it weren't spelled out. Also be sure that you are clear on state and federal laws on FMLA and other issues which can be inclusive or exclusive related to relationships and families. For example, while a lot of progress has been made in Wisconsin and other states around marriage rights for same-sex couples, parenting rights have not necessarily caught up. So it's been a little bit challenging and unclear whether or not people have sort of equal footing around parenting, even if they're legally married. So that's just an example of something that hasn't completely been worked out and certainly wasn't automatic with the legalization of marriage. So in short, be sure that the families of your employees are supported and protected even when the legal system has not yet caught up. And one way is to just sort of try these out and ask people, would this apply to your family? You can ask existing employees, for example. One policy that might be unique for internal purposes is one supporting transgender employees who may be transitioning. And as I developed this and pulled up one of the examples, I thought this could really be used potentially for transitioning clients as well. So an example offered by the Virginia Anti-Violence Project, and again the link will be included on that resources sheet, combines policies for transgender individuals seeking services and transgender employees. In general, transgender inclusion policies focus on respect, privacy, and support, and their implementation are driven by the transgender individual themselves. So we'll look at each of these elements. Respect is key in that individuals should have a right to be addressed when you speak to them and about them, which I know we talked about particularly in the first webinar. Making sure you're addressing them as the gender with which they identify. Privacy reminds us that a person's transition is entitled to protection from agency-wide knowledge, and elements of it should only be shared with the employee's explicit permission. Support seems self-explanatory, yet it might be best informed by literally asking the transitioning coworker, what would my support of you look like? So it's again consistent with the theme of people would rather be asked what their pronouns are, how you can support them, et cetera, than having us assume how they might want that to look. And we're going to look at that transgender policy sample in just a second. One important step to success for these employee policies that also doubles as a way to attract LGBTQ employees is being clear about your LGBTQ-related policies before hiring new staff. So in other words, sharing those as part of the interview process. This lets potential employees know what is expected of them in terms of the environment and non-discrimination policy, for example, and where the agency stands on these issues. It also communicates the inclusive environment established by your agency, again, both to applicants but also back to their communities. All right, so here's an example of a policy supportive of transgender employees. And again, like I said, it might be able to use it with some modification for clients as well. And it's an example from the Virginia Anti-Violence Project. This one is geared towards rights, again, of transgender employees. As with the non-discrimination example, this is one, again, that can be adapted to clients as well. One thing that I really like about the example is it includes specificity about how to be supportive of transgender employees, including clothing, pronouns, and privacy. And so instead of just saying you need to be inclusive and supportive, it talks about, and I think a more extended language talks about how to treat people and how to respect those different rights as well. So this is, I think, a subset of the language. So once policies are in place, and I know that that's a few steps away for some folks, it's equally as important to know how to train people on how to utilize them and how to follow them. If prevention is the goal, knowledge always comes first. And so as we emphasized in the first webinar, knowledge about LGBTQ people and how intimate partner violence can uniquely affect them can go a long way to understanding how inclusion can help. In the second webinar, one of the concepts covered was how treating everyone the same might fall short. To give your policies the best chance of being followed, staff and administration must value ongoing learning. The first webinar may be a great tool to kick off learning about LGBTQ communities for new employees. The agencies that have had the most success with being welcoming to LGBTQ people and, I suspect, other marginalized populations train to the edges. In other words, everyone from the director to advocates to receptionists to volunteers gets substantial, consistent, and ongoing training on these issues. Training must be required and frequent. Some ways to keep it fresh instead of kind of always using the same information would be to review actual situations that have come up. So, for example, at a staff meeting, so a number of you identified, I think it was about a third, identified that you've had some situations where someone complained about another client's gender identity or sexual orientation. And so that would be a perfect example of then using that to talk together as a staff about how people might handle it. It can also talk about local and national LGBTQ issues and events, obviously particularly if they come up around intimate partner violence. Equally as important as employees understanding the policies for victims and survivors is understanding inclusive and protective employee policies like we talked about. Emphasizing how the policies will work for staff reinforces the philosophy that your entire agency is inclusive and supportive of LGBTQ people. Victims and survivors will see their community supported on staff and vice versa. The phrase "learn it and do it" reminds us that training and policies are only as good as the action they put in motion. Using inclusive language, for example, can seem awkward or cumbersome at first, particularly if you're not accustomed with using the word partner, using pronouns like they, them, and theirs, one of the ones that we mentioned in the previous webinars. Yet with practice, this language will become routine and the rewards can be significant. And this is a great place to just use an example. So a colleague that I train with talks about how we already use they, them, and theirs, and maybe I gave this example in the last webinar, but it's common if we don't know somebody's pronoun to kind of default to that. So the more we are using it for people when they request it, the more we'll get used to it. One of my favorite tips for people working with LGBTQ clients is a brief apology. It's easy to make a mistake when we're learning a new skill. So when you use the wrong pronoun or term, offer a simple apology like, "I'm sorry, I used the wrong pronoun. I know which one to use. I'll do better." And then move on and really do better. Nothing makes an uncomfortable situation more uncomfortable than excessive apologizing. Then both people get involved in trying to make each other feel better. A simple, sincere apology can go a long way. So speaking of that, let's look at a few ways to interrupt hurtful comments. So one model that's shared here is adapted from a resource developed by the Anti-Violence Project of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And the title they've used is "Name It, Claim It, Stop It, and Then Walk Away." So that obviously kind of outlines what the steps are. Sometimes it can be helpful to have specific language or at least a model or plan for how to address hurtful comments. This model is best for a kind of in-the-moment conversation, maybe not one where a lot of education is going to take place, but a quicker interaction with someone. I'll show a more comprehensive model in just a minute. So this one also might be better in kind of personal interactions. And so sometimes I've heard people say, if they hear something waiting in a line at the grocery store or something like that, that this might be the kind of quick interaction model that they would use. So the first step is naming what just happened. So an example might be, "I just heard you say that's so gay," or "It's a put down when you refuse to sit at the same table with, the other person." And then claiming how that action makes you feel. So you might say, "That offends me because my best friend is a lesbian. That hurts us because it makes our space feel unsafe." And then stopping it from being repeated. So saying, I don't want to hear that again," or I don't want you to say that again. And then for those of us that find some of these conflicts really uncomfortable, myself included, giving yourself permission to walk away from the situation if it makes sense and not waiting for excuses or getting pulled into an argument. So this should be really brief. And again, this one might be a little bit better for sort of personal interactions, but it is one model. We'll look at a more extensive model that might be a little more useful in a workplace setting, but this is a good one to sort of get us warmed up. All right, so figuring out how to use the policies once they're in place and getting a little bit more specific about that. So the monitoring of policy use and documentation when the policies were not followed should not be wildly different from any other policies within your agencies. In other words, you likely already have some ways to follow up on when a policy is not used. So here's a few tips that can help. One way to monitor the use is to have a person or two in charge of keeping an eye out for how the policies are being followed. Perhaps one for policies that are LGBTQ-related policies that apply to clients and one for employees. In both cases, there should really also be two people for for each in the event that one of the persons on the lookout is not following the policies. In other words, if you put just one person in charge of this and then an event happens where they're involved, it might be really challenging for folks to feel like they're heard in that situation. So there should be two people identified, perhaps the same two, to be individuals to whom a person reports discrimination, bullying, and harassment, and again, making sure that you have more than one person so that, for example, if a manager or a program director or something is a person who's not following the policy, that there's someone else in terms of accountability. You may also consider seeking feedback from LGBTQ clients and employees, as well as having LGBTQ people involved in the review of policies and any sort of monitoring model that you come up with. In addition, you could have LGBTQ people test some of the policies, like calling a crisis line or accessing information and services via your website, and talking openly about their gender identity, their relationship status, etc., so that they can test out how the policies go. Develop a form to document your claims in writing, and again, this is likely something that you already have as part of human resources and agency policy, making sure that you remember that the person raising the issue is not necessarily identifying as LGBTQ by raising the issue. I think that's an important point, and that might keep people from reporting. So when you're doing training around your policies, make sure that you're telling your fellow employees that you won't interpret them telling you that something like this has happened as them coming up to you, because obviously that could be a barrier for people, particularly if people are not out and they're trying to report the harassment. If you ever feel like claims are frequent or policies are just plain not working, either they're not addressing the issue or not being upheld, that's probably a good sign that you should reassess the policies themselves, the model that you've developed for how to monitor them, and then the training that employees and volunteers have received. If you need additional training on any of these issues or just some help thinking through next steps, again, we're going to talk at the end about how you can get some technical assistance around that. And remember to also look back at some of the resources that we've provided in the 3 webinars. All right, third and final poll. So I'm going to read this one, and then we'll go to the part where you can actually click on it. So you overhear a coworker say, "He's really a man," about a transgender woman at your support group. What would you do next? And the options are confront your coworker, report to your supervisor, or ignore the comment and support the client. So again, this one's a little different because we're talking about someone who's a fellow employee along with you. Oh, there it is. So it looks like most people, about 3/4 of you, are intending to talk to the coworker about it. Maybe confront is too strong of a word. Talk with your coworker might have been better. And this one might be a good opportunity to start with that simple model that we used. Name it, claim it, stop it, and walk away, depending on the situation. But if you all have been through this training, it might be a great opportunity to remind the other person about what you've learned. And also, because I'm always thinking of open-ended questions, it might be a good opportunity to ask them, what bothers you about that? What are you having a hard time with? And, again, depending on your relationship with the person and the situation. Great. Thank you for doing the poll. All right, so this is that more comprehensive model that I mentioned. And the following model is based on something from the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance Project, and then the folks that developed this one have added an additional step. And it can be used for bias against LGBTQ people, but also other underserved and oppressed groups as well. So there is a slide set that includes, and there's a link on that resources sheet, that includes some more in-depth information about this. But I think this is one that's a little more comprehensive than the name it, claim it, stop it, and walk away. So I'm just going to briefly walk through each of the steps. So the first one is to be prepared to respond to this. And hopefully some of the things that are going through your head right now are thinking, well, what would I have said in that situation, and what might be a couple ways I could start the conversation? I know when I think I'm going to have a challenging conversation, it's good to think that through ahead of time. So you might think of some questions that would be useful, like, why did you say that? Or tell me more about what you meant when you said that. Would just be a good way to kind of open up the conversation when you hear some biased conversation like this. And maybe even practice saying it, because these can be really challenging conversations. The second one, identifying new behavior. I think it's important to specifically point out what they said that you found troubling or biased. They might not actually know what it is. So you might say something like, why do you feel that way? It's a good time to name your and your agency's stance on that issue and correct any misinformation. You know, like in that poll that we just used, the person both said, he's really a man. So there's like kind of a lot of opportunity there to offer a way to reframe that and say, actually she uses this name and identifies as a woman. That way you're offering a different pronoun, maybe offering the name that she's provided, which maybe the person didn't know, and then clarifying that the person has self-identified as female. And then offer support to anyone who may have been hurt in the situation, so if someone overheard it, and then reiterating to that person the policy and stance. And I guess in terms of identifying the behavior, I want to go back to that one for just a second and make sure that I emphasize making sure that the language that you use isn't inflammatory. And sometimes we can get really emotional about these things, and it can be easy to do. So make sure that you're talking about what the person said and not attaching any label to it. For example, saying to them, that was a put down, or that was discriminatory when you said that, or that sounded harassing, but not to call them names. So sometimes we might have a tendency to want to say, you know, you sounded homophobic, or you sounded like a homophobe, and that just contributes to the negative feelings. It's better to tell them how what they said sounded, you know, and say, like, that was a put down, that was derogatory. We obviously don't want to get into a battle of name calling, and that goes without saying, but I think it can be easy to get carried away with our own emotions when we're upset. And then the next one, setting some limits, so telling them, you know, that behavior, we don't allow that here, or we don't want people to talk like that here. We don't use names like that for people. Here's what we've done instead. We talk about people with the names that they've provided and the pronouns that they've provided, regardless of, you know, what their paperwork says or how we think they look. And then appealing to shared values, which I think can be really helpful. So talking about, you know, we all believe in respect, or we're all here to serve victims and create a supportive environment when people are in crisis. So kind of bringing it back around to commonalities. And then finding an ally, being an ally, finding like-minded people for support, particularly after an event like this happens. It can be helpful to talk to someone else, obviously without breaching confidentiality, but just to get some support for yourself because you just had a sort of challenging conversation with someone. And then the follow-through could be if you think that there needs to be a claim against the policy, but also just to go back to other people that were present that might not have been addressed, that you might not talk to about the event, and reminding them of the policy. And I guess with all of these, that these are really baby steps. It's unlikely that you're going to change someone's attitude, whether it's a client or a coworker, that they've long held, but providing them with some new language and reminding them of the policy can be really helpful and can help even that sort of baby step forward to change. And I think this next one we've already used. I think this one's a repeat, so I'm going to skip this one, but it's, again, that example from the Network Lorette about anti-discrimination policy. And then here's one that's from a slightly different source, Human Rights Campaign, and this is the American Medical Association's statement around how to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I just want to draw attention to the language that they use. The office appreciates the diversity of human beings and does not discriminate based on, and then you'll see that in this case they use sexual orientation and gender identity. So in part I put this one in there just to see another sample, but also to show that, there are really positive ways to word these, to say we appreciate the diversity of human beings. as opposed to do not discriminate. So you'll have to determine for yourself what works best for your agency, but I wanted to make sure that people had another model for how to look at that. So I think we've come full circle back to the federal language, and so I think, Sharon, I'm going to turn it back to you both to remind folks of that language, but then also I think I've said a couple times during the webinar that we will give folks some direction, or you will, on how to ask for help around their policy development.
Right. This is just a brief and friendly reminder that the participation in these 3 webinars is actually a grant requirement. All programs that receive funding through DCF, must develop a practice of promoting access and inclusion for LGBTQ individuals, as well as developing those non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies that we just talked about. And I really want this to be a thoughtful process for programs, and I want programs to work on developing those policies during this grant period. Very clear instruction will be provided to directors of programs as to exactly what those expectations are. Moving on, what the expectations are of our federal funder are assuring that the needs of LGBTQ people are taken into consideration in all of your agency's programming, establishing and publicizing those policies that we've been talking about on prohibiting harassment based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, as well as the other protected categories, and training staff members to respond to bullying and harassment in all forms. And clearly, that's what these 3 webinars are all about. What we will be doing as a follow-up to these webinars are developing an FAQ page that deals with questions that have come up during the webinars or after the webinars on points either that might be unclear or that we want to make sure that we emphasize. I encourage programs who feel that they need further training or technical assistance to contact staff at End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin, our training and TA organization. And End Abuse, I think, can kind of be a gatekeeper, so to speak, of trying to either provide that technical assistance themselves or to bring in somebody else who can respond more comprehensively to that particular need, question, or request. And I would definitely like to thank everybody for participating in these webinars. I fully support the learning that will come from them, and I really encourage you to, again, use this as an opportunity to examine your agency culture in a way with a lot of humility, and so we can all work together to create a movement that brings everyone, all survivors, from the margins to the center.
So this concludes the webinar, Development and Maintenance of Policies Prohibiting Harassment of LGBTQ People. Again, thank you for joining us today, and this webinar was recorded on March 10th of 2015.